4 years have been erased from your life, and you can't recall a single moment from that entire period. You don't know where you were, what happened to you, or why you were kept in darkness for all those years. This is not just a story about a disappearance. This is a story about a return that makes everything once believed to be true become questionable. A couple steps into the Superstition Mountains, a place where people can vanish without any explanation. 4 years later, only one of them appears by the roadside, emaciated, in a state of panic, as if they just stepped out from a place that doesn't belong to this world. The other never returns with her. What happened in that 4-year void and the true fate of the husband is a mystery that chills the blood. The most terrifying thing about this story is not the mountain itself, but the silence of closed case files, and the silence of the survivor carrying memories that cannot be put into words. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. The Superstition Mountains are located on the eastern edge of the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, a barren and rugged mountain range dissected by deep canyons, steep slopes, narrow valleys, and trails that can easily disappear under the desert sun and wind. Where daytime temperatures can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and drop sharply at night. This area has long been known as a dangerous region, not only because of its harsh natural conditions, but also due to a thick history of accidents, getting lost, and unexplained disappearances from 19th century miners searching for treasure to modern hikers who underestimate the risks of the terrain, many of those cases ending with prolonged searches that were eventually called off without bodies ever being found. Daniel Harper, 38, a freelance construction engineering worker, and his wife Emily Harper, 34, a healthcare worker at a community clinic in Phoenix, lived together in the eastern suburbs of the city. They were not professional mountaineers, but regularly took short weekend hikes, mostly on clearly marked trails. The trip into the Superstition Mountains took place in early spring 2012, when the weather was considered more pleasant than in summer, and according to the original plan, it was just a 2-day, 1-night trekking trip with light camping, intended for relaxation and a brief escape from urban life. Daniel was the one who suggested the route, believing they would follow a popular trail, while Emily agreed on the condition that they return before evening on the second day, because she had a work schedule early the following week. According to the itinerary shared with family, the two were expected to leave the mountain area on Sunday afternoon, with enough time to return to Phoenix before dark. The last time Daniel and Emily were seen was on Saturday morning, when they stopped near the trailhead to check the map and prepare their gear before heading deeper into the mountains. After that, no one could confirm having seen them on the trail. When Sunday evening passed without any call or message saying they had returned home, the family began to worry, initially thinking it might be poor cell service or that the couple had decided to stay an extra night. But by Monday morning, all attempts to contact them went unanswered, and both Daniel's and Emily's phones were completely unreachable. The prolonged silence beyond the expected return time quickly turned initial assumptions into serious concern, especially since the family knew well that the Superstition Mountains were not a place where one could casually extend a trip without leaving any information. By noon that same day, with all contact efforts yielding no results, and no signs indicating that Daniel and Emily had safely left the Superstition Mountains area, the family realized the delay had gone beyond acceptable limits. After considering scenarios ranging from lost signal to getting lost in the wilderness, they made the decision no one wanted to make: contact local police to officially report Daniel Harper and Emily Harper as missing. The call was received at the county sheriff's office in the early afternoon, marking the moment the matter shifted from family concern to an official law enforcement case file, in which the reporting party clearly stated that the two had not returned at the notified time, had been completely out of contact for over 24 hours, and were last confirmed to be in the Superstition Mountains area. A location local police were well aware carried a high level of risk. Following standard procedure, the on-duty officer immediately logged the case as a missing persons report and began asking key questions to determine whether this was just a routine delay or had crossed the safety threshold, based on factors such as the planned return schedule, the victim's outdoor experience, recent weather conditions, and the terrain characteristics at the last confirmed location. Based on the initial information, police quickly classified Daniel and Emily as overdue hikers, a term used for hikers who fail to return as planned but show no clear signs of crime or serious accident, while emphasizing that in the context of the Superstition Mountains, prolonged delays always carried high-risk potential. During the process of gathering information from the family, police requested details about the planned itinerary, the route they said they would take, starting point, departure time from home, vehicle used, health status, communication habits when away, and any last-minute changes to the plan that might have been mentioned. The family stated that Daniel was the proactive planner who often studied maps before each trip, while Emily tended to be more cautious and always stressed sticking to return times, and they affirmed that such prolonged loss of contact was completely out of character for both. Police also recorded information about the couple's residence, Emily's work schedule early in the week, personal commitments that would make staying longer in the mountains, without prior notice, highly unlikely, and the fact that no family member or friend had received any messages or calls since the two entered the mountain area. From the collected data, an initial timeline was established, starting from when Daniel and Emily left Phoenix, the last known stop near the trailhead, the expected completion time of the trip, and the point when the family recognized the delay, with the largest gap being the period from when the two entered the Superstition Mountains until they were due to return. This gap was considered particularly alarming due to the complete absence of any intermediate signals or information confirming their safety. When assessing the level of danger, police considered multiple simultaneous factors, including daytime and nighttime temperatures in the mountains, access to water sources, terrain complexity, and the history of lost hiker cases in the area, many of which showed that even a small navigational error could lead to serious consequences in a short time. The fact that the two had been out of contact well beyond the expected time frame made the possibility of them simply extending the trip far less convincing, especially given Emily's cautious nature and her pending work obligations. After compiling the information and internal discussion, police determined that the case had surpassed the threshold of ordinary delay and needed to be treated as a life-threatening emergency, meaning no further time could be spent waiting for passive data collection. The decision was made to proceed with next steps to verify Daniel and Emily's last known position and assess the likelihood they were still in the Superstition Mountains area, with the initial focus on mobilizing appropriate resources for search efforts, while the case file was updated from a simple missing persons report to one requiring urgent response due to high environmental risk. Once the case was classified as a life-threatening emergency, the county sheriff's office immediately activated standard search and rescue procedures for missing persons in wilderness environments, first notifying and coordinating with the sheriff's office responsible for the jurisdiction, the park rangers managing the Superstition Mountains area, and trained volunteer search and rescue units specialized in desert terrain. Mobilization was carried out in stages, starting with readily available rapid response teams in the county, then expanding to neighboring support groups to ensure sufficient personnel for a campaign that could last multiple days. In the initial deployment phase, a temporary command center was established near the trailhead area where Daniel and Emily were believed to have begun their journey. This center was responsible for coordinating personnel, receiving field updates from search teams, and continuously updating the sheriff's office on the situation. Based on data collected from the family and initial sources, the search area was divided into multiple specific zones, each with clearly defined boundaries based on existing trail systems, canyons, slopes, and valleys, under the assumption that the two victims may not have strayed far from the popular route in the early stages. Each zone was assigned to a responsible team with tasks to systematically sweep the area using linear methods to avoid missing any traces. In parallel with spatial division of the search, weather conditions at the time of deployment were thoroughly assessed, including high daytime temperatures, low humidity, strong afternoon winds, and the potential for sharp nighttime drops, all factors that could directly impact the survival chances of the missing persons as well as searcher safety. Weather forecasts for the following days indicated possible strong winds and localized fog in higher areas, reducing visibility and increasing accident risk for teams moving on steep rocky terrain, forcing the command center to carefully balance the need to expand the search scope with ensuring personnel safety. The terrain of the Superstition Mountains was described in detail by park rangers during coordination meetings, emphasizing that the area not only had marked trails but also many natural side paths, dry washes, and rock slide sections that could cause hikers to unintentionally leave the main path without realizing it, especially under rapidly changing light conditions or when moving to avoid sun exposure. Additionally, the presence of old mine shafts, high cliffs, and areas with sharp rocks significantly increased the risk of injury in case of a fall. From a risk assessment perspective, the command center identified that the likelihood of Daniel and Emily having suffered an accident due to terrain or becoming disoriented was the priority scenario to consider in the early phase, while also noting that both going missing together increased complexity, as if one encountered trouble, the other might have attempted to seek help and inadvertently fallen into similar danger. Access limitations quickly became apparent, as some key areas were only reachable by technical climbing or helicopter, while wind and terrain conditions did not allow continuous aerial deployment. This forced search teams to prioritize higher probability zones before considering expansion into higher-risk regions. Additionally, maintaining communication between teams in terrain with unstable radio signals was identified as a major challenge, leading the command center to establish intermediate communication points and limit each team's daily operating time to avoid prolonged loss of contact. All these factors made the search operation highly cautious from the outset, with constant balancing between the urgent need to find Daniel and Emily and the duty to protect the safety of participating personnel, while reflecting the reality that in an environment like the Superstition Mountains, not every area can be accessed quickly or safely, even as time pressure continued to mount. On the first day of the expanded search campaign, one of the most significant findings recorded was that the vehicle used by Daniel and Emily Harper was located in the parking area near the entrance to a main trail in the Superstition Mountains. This location matched the information provided by the family regarding the intended starting point of their trip. The vehicle was parked neatly in an area designated for overnight parking, with no signs of collision, vandalism, or any indication that it had been moved after being stopped. The keys were not found outside the vehicle, and all doors were in a locked state as when the users had left it. The discovery of the vehicle occurred in the morning, just a few hours after search teams began sweeping the area, and it was precisely time-stamped to align with the initial timeline. The time the vehicle was found was consistent with the assumption that Daniel and Emily had proceeded into the mountain area as planned, without external interference at the starting point. After the vehicle was identified, search teams expanded the radius around the parking area, focusing on trails leading away from this location. During this process, various personal items began to be discovered scattered in different areas. The first items found included an empty water bottle located not far from the parking area, on a section of trail with a gentle incline. This position was recorded with specific coordinates and marked on the search map for later comparison. The condition of the water bottle indicated it had been fully used, with no signs of heavy impact damage, and it was positioned in a spot easily visible to hikers. This led search teams to note it, but refrain from drawing any conclusive assessment at the time of discovery. In the following hours, as other groups swept adjacent areas, a small backpack was discovered at a lower position relative to the main trail, near a shallow rock crevice. The backpack was identified as belonging to Emily based on the family's description. Inside were still some personal items, such as light clothing, toiletries, and basic medical supplies, all in dry condition, not torn or seriously damaged. The backpack's location was noted as a considerable walking distance from the parking area, but still within a reasonable range for the first day of a trek, and the time of its discovery was cross-checked with the timeline to confirm it was found after the search campaign had been underway for approximately 1 day. Along with the backpack, other items such as a hat, gloves, and a neatly folded paper map were also found at various locations. Each item was marked, photographed in place, and its condition recorded before collection to ensure no potential scene disturbance. The overall condition of these items showed no obvious destruction by weather or wildlife, with no clear signs of prolonged sun exposure or dragging across rocky terrain. This was recorded as a factual observation rather than interpreted at this stage. Spatially, the finds were not concentrated at a single point, but distributed along several trail segments and adjacent areas, forming a chain of marked positions on the search map. The distances between these points were close enough to suggest a connection in terms of movement, yet sufficiently dispersed to raise questions about the sequence and circumstances under which the items were left behind. Each discovery was recorded with a specific time of day, allowing command to compare against the estimated time Daniel and Emily entered the area, thereby determining that these items had most likely been there before the search campaign began, rather than being disturbed by search activities. Search teams also noted that there were no signs the items had been arranged or gathered together. Instead, they appeared at different locations as if abandoned during movement. However, at this point, the records remained at the level of objective description, without assumptions about specific causes or circumstances. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle, along with personal items in the early days of the search, provided key data points for the case file, helping to reinforce the initial timeline and confirm that Daniel and Emily had indeed entered the Superstition Mountains as planned. It also created a set of discovery points requiring more detailed analysis in subsequent steps of the search process. Within the scope of this phase, however, all facts were recorded independently, systematically, and without attachment to any investigative conclusions beyond identifying the location, condition, and timing of each find relative to the known timeline. After the initial physical finds were recorded and fully mapped, the search command along with investigators moved into the evaluation phase, in which each piece of data was examined no longer as isolated fragments, but as a collection to be placed in the context of typical hiker behavior and previously documented wilderness missing person scenarios in the Superstition Mountains. First, Daniel and Emily's abandonment of the vehicle at the parking area near the trailhead was analyzed from multiple angles. In most typical missing hiker cases, the vehicle is found exactly at the expected starting point, reflecting voluntary entry into the mountain area. In this case, the vehicle's position matched the family-provided information and showed no signs of movement or external interference, reinforcing the assumption that the two had begun their journey as planned and did not encounter an incident right at the parking area. However, when compared to prior cases, investigators also noted that orderly abandonment of the vehicle did not rule out the possibility of a serious incident occurring later, as many missing persons had ventured deep into the mountains in completely normal condition before encountering health issues, accidents, or disorientation. For the personal items found, evaluation was based on the type of item, its condition, and its location. In typical missing hiker cases, victims tend to retain essential items such as water, backpack, clothing, and maps until they can no longer move, or in panic situations, may abandon non-essential items while still carrying the most critical survival gear. In this case, the empty water bottle found on the trail indicated it had been fully consumed, which did not contradict the hypothesis of normal movement on the first day. However, Emily's backpack was found at a lower position off the main trail, containing full personal items and showing no signs of disturbance, prompting investigators to question the circumstances under which the backpack was left behind. Since in most missing hiker cases, the backpack is retained as the last source of supplies, the neatly folded paper map was also closely examined. As in disorientation situations, hikers frequently take the map out for repeated use, resulting in crumpling, tearing, or leaving it exposed in visible positions, whereas the map's condition in this case showed no signs of prolonged or urgent use. When compared to typical missing hiker files in the Superstition Mountains, Command observed some superficial similarities, such as items found along trails and within a range accessible on the first day. At the same time, however, there were points that did not fully align, particularly the distribution of items not following a clear pattern of panicked or exhausted movement, which usually leads to more concentrated finds when the missing person can no longer travel far. Additionally, the relatively intact condition of the items, with minimal weather or wildlife impact, led investigators to consider the possibility that they had not been abandoned for an excessively long time before being found, raising questions about the precise timing of when Daniel and Emily encountered an incident relative to the expected timeline. Another factor incorporated into the evaluation was the fact that both individuals went missing together. In many paired missing hiker cases, one person often tries to stay with the other or attempts to return to the trail for help, resulting in diverging movement traces. In contrast, the finds in this case did not show a clear pattern of separation or attempted return. Investigators also considered terrain accident scenarios, such as slipping into a rock crevice or down a steep slope. But the absence of torn clothing, blood, or heavily damaged items in nearby areas meant this scenario could not yet be confirmed in the initial evaluation phase. All of these analyses did not lead to a definitive conclusion, but helped clarify points of alignment and misalignment with typical missing hiker scenarios, thereby highlighting information gaps that needed further clarification, particularly the reasons and circumstances under which important items were abandoned in relatively intact condition and distributed in a manner not fully matching recorded behavioral patterns from previous missing person cases in the Superstition Mountains. After completing the evaluation of the initial physical finds and determining that the collected data was insufficient to clearly conclude Daniel and Emily Harper's direction of travel, Command decided to deploy the K9 tracking phase, a standard step in wilderness missing person cases, to determine the victim's initial movement trajectory and detect anomalies that might have been overlooked by ordinary observation. The mobilized K9 teams included dogs specially trained for live person search with the ability to distinguish individual scents in the hot, dry, and complex terrain of the Superstition Mountains. Reference scents were taken from personal items definitively identified as belonging to Daniel and Emily, prioritizing items with direct body contact and minimal cross-contamination from others to ensure the highest accuracy in tracking. The starting point for scent tracking operations was set at the parking area where the couple's vehicle was found, as this was the last location where their presence could be confirmed with certainty before they entered the mountain area. When the tracking process began, the K9 units quickly picked up the scent and led search teams in a direction consistent with the main trail leading deeper into the Superstition Mountains. This result was initially viewed as aligning with the assumption that the two had moved along the planned route during the early phase of the trip. In the initial period, the scent direction remained relatively stable, overlapping with previously swept areas and locations where some personal items had been found. This reinforced the assessment that Daniel and Emily had indeed hiked along the trail for a certain period before any incident occurred. However, as teams continued following the scent deeper into the mountains, an anomaly began to emerge. The personal scents of Daniel and Emily did not lead the K9 units into more inaccessible areas such as deep canyons or steep slopes, places where scent could persist if the victims continued on foot. Instead, at a point not far from the main trail, the scent direction began to weaken and then ended abruptly, with no signs of continuation or dispersion in other directions as typically seen when missing persons keep moving or veer off trail. The scent termination point was carefully marked and thoroughly swept by search teams, including checks of the surrounding area for footprints, drag marks, torn clothing, or any items that might indicate Daniel and Emily had continued moving by other means. But no additional discoveries were recorded at that time. The abrupt end of the personal scents at a specific location was regarded as a significant data point. In typical missing hiker cases, scent usually continues to areas where the victim attempts to climb higher for a vantage point, descend for water, or scatters when the missing person changes direction multiple times due to panic. In contrast, the clear termination of scent at a relatively accessible point raised questions about the possibility that Daniel and Emily did not continue traveling on foot after this point. Investigators also considered environmental factors that might cause scent loss, such as strong winds, high temperatures, or dry rocky terrain causing rapid scent dissipation. However, the K9 specialists involved in the campaign noted that weather conditions during tracking were not severe enough to fully explain the sudden disappearance of scent, especially when other missing person cases in the area under similar conditions still allowed for longer scent trails. Additionally, the fact that both individuals' scents ended in the same area rather than diverging in separate directions was recorded as a point of note. In accident or panic situations, individual scents often tend to diverge based on separate behaviors. After no further movement direction was found from the scent termination point, K9 teams repeated the tracking process from different starting points, including the backpack discovery location and other personal item sites, to check for possible initial tracking errors. The results remained consistent. The personal scents of Daniel and Emily existed only within a certain range and did not lead to any continuing route out of the marked area. The results of the K9 tracking phase were compiled and reported to command as a set of objective facts, without speculative conclusions. They clearly indicated that after a determined point in their initial movement, there was no evidence that Daniel and Emily continued walking in any direction within the Superstition Mountains. This reality made explaining their disappearance more complex than in typical missing hiker cases and raised new questions about what may have occurred at the point where the scent trail ended. When the trailing phase using police dogs failed to provide the next direction of travel, and the collected data began to show clear limitations to expanding the search, the command team was forced to confront the increasingly harsh reality of environmental conditions in the Superstition Mountains, where the weather began deteriorating beyond initial forecasts. Daytime temperatures rose higher than average, while nights brought strong winds and localized fog in higher areas, severely restricting visibility and increasing the risk of accidents for teams operating on steep rocky terrain. Intermittent light rain combined with strong gusts also made rock surfaces slippery, especially dangerous in narrow canyons and near vertical slopes, where a single slip could lead to severe injury or death, not only for the missing persons, but also for search personnel. In daily coordination meetings, park rangers and terrain experts continuously updated risk assessments, emphasizing that several areas within the initial search radius had become nearly impossible to access safely on foot, while helicopter use was restricted due to strong winds and complex terrain, creating hazardous downdrafts and vortices. These areas included deep canyons, sheer cliffs, and loose rock slide zones, where access required professional mountaineering techniques and specialized equipment that the initial search operation was not fully equipped to deploy on a broad scale. Alongside evaluating accessibility, the command team also conducted survival probability analysis for Daniel and Emily over time, based on factors such as the amount of water and food they could have carried, their level of wilderness experience, weather conditions, and the terrain where they were believed to have traveled in the early days. Rescue experts pointed out that in the hot, dry desert environment of the Superstition Mountains, a hiker's survival odds without supplemental water typically drop sharply after just a few days. And if injury or disorientation occurred, that time frame could shrink significantly. In Daniel and Emily's case, the prolonged loss of contact exceeding 1 week was beginning to make survival scenarios increasingly implausible. The command team also reviewed on-site evidence, including the lack of any new movement tracks, no distress signals detected, and no findings indicating attempts to reach major water sources or alternative trails, behaviors commonly seen in individuals still capable of movement and self-rescue efforts. All these factors were incorporated into a comprehensive assessment to determine whether maintaining the current search scale remained reasonable, especially when weighing the hope of finding the missing against the rising risks to participating personnel. After many days of continuous high-intensity operations, searcher fatigue became an unavoidable factor, as maintaining focus and safety in such a harsh environment required stable physical and mental condition, something difficult to sustain in a prolonged campaign without clear progress. In that context, the command team decided to narrow the search perimeter, concentrating on areas with the highest probability based on existing findings, while temporarily halting expansion into high-risk, unaccessed zones to minimize the chance of casualties among rescue personnel. This decision did not mean completely terminating search efforts, but reflected a strategic adjustment based on actual environmental conditions, resource limitations, and time-based survival probability assessments, shifting the objective from wide-area sweeping to maintaining surveillance and readiness to respond if new information or leads emerged. After the search perimeter was reduced and no further breakthrough discoveries occurred, the campaign command conducted a full-scale review of all data collected throughout the operation, including family-provided information, on-site findings, K9 trailing results, weather conditions, and terrain evaluations, in order to issue an official conclusion in line with current professional standards. In the consolidated report, the participating agencies unanimously concluded that there was no direct evidence of third-party involvement, no signs of violence, struggle, or criminal scene disturbance, and no physical evidence suggesting criminal activity, such as vehicle tampering, weapons, or unusual items unrelated to Daniel and Emily. On that basis, the official conclusion was issued. Daniel Harper and Emily Harper were classified as presumed death due to exposure, a term used for missing persons cases in wilderness settings where severe natural conditions are deemed the most likely cause of death, even when no bodies are recovered. This conclusion rested on a combination of factors: prolonged loss of contact beyond the expected timeframe, no signs of continued movement past the end of the scent trail, extended adverse weather, the treacherous terrain of the Superstition Mountains, and the historical record of similar missing persons cases in the area that ended without survivors. Investigators also noted that failing to locate bodies in a desert mountain environment is not uncommon, due to factors such as scavenging wildlife, difficult access, and rapid decomposition in high temperatures, which can make remains exceptionally hard to detect even after large-scale searches. Alongside determining the presumed cause of death, the report stated that, at that time, there was no legal basis to open a criminal investigation, as all available evidence aligned with an accident or lost in the wilderness scenario leading to environmental death, and did not meet the threshold of suspicion required to reclassify the case as criminal. Not opening a criminal investigation meant no further actions such as suspect-oriented interviews, advanced forensic analysis, or pursuit of potential perpetrators. Instead, efforts focused on completing the search file and archiving data for future reference. The families of Daniel and Emily were informed of this conclusion in a formal meeting, where agency representatives detailed the search process, the factors considered, and the reasoning behind the presumed death due to exposure finding, while stressing that this was not a legal declaration of death, such as a death certificate, but a professional assessment based on probability and available evidence. In the case file, Daniel and Emily's status was updated from active missing persons search to cold case, meaning no regular active search operations continued, but the file remained in the system for potential reactivation if credible new information or leads surfaced. The transition to cold case status also reflected the practical limits of agency resources, as large-scale searches cannot be maintained indefinitely without progress, especially in high-risk areas for personnel. Although the initial conclusion had been reached, the report noted that the Superstition Mountains are a region with complex terrain and history, where not every disappearance can be fully explained by standard models, and the absence of criminal evidence at this stage did not permanently rule out all other possibilities. However, within the scope of responsibility and evidence available at the time, presumed death due to exposure was deemed the most appropriate conclusion under professional standards, closing the active search phase and formally placing the Daniel Harper and Emily Harper case into cold case status within law enforcement systems. After the file on Daniel and Emily Harper was officially moved to cold case status, time passed slowly but relentlessly, and the case gradually faded from the focus of law enforcement agencies, which had to continually allocate resources to new emerging emergencies in the region. In the first few months following the issuance of the presumed death due to exposure conclusion, the file was still periodically reviewed per protocol, but no new information or leads were added. There were no sightings reported elsewhere, no financial activity, no communication data, and no incidental discoveries by hikers or hunters in the Superstition Mountains. As months turned into a full year, case-related activity was reduced almost entirely to archival storage and reference status, with the file flagged for review only if reliable new information emerged, though in reality, no such catalyst appeared to prompt reopening search or investigative efforts. For the families of Daniel and Emily, this period carried especially heavy weight. The shift from waiting for a possible call or new lead to confronting prolonged silence created deep, hard-to-repair fractures. Family members held differing views on whether to continue hoping or accept the initial conclusion, leading to tension, disagreement, and eventually growing distance. Some continued individual search efforts, contacting volunteer groups or monitoring Superstition Mountains related information, while others, after months without results, began to withdraw from such activities due to emotional and financial exhaustion. Over time, family gatherings that once centered on sharing updates and planning searches became increasingly rare, and the disappearance of Daniel and Emily, rather than a shared goal, turned into a painful topic many avoided mentioning. On the agency side, the case was no longer prioritized, as professional evaluations indicated an extremely low probability of finding survivors after such an extended period. Particularly in the harsh Superstition Mountains environment, officers who participated in the initial search were reassigned to other duties, and detailed institutional knowledge of the case gradually resided only in reports and archived files. Although the file remained in the system and could theoretically be reopened, the complete lack of new leads turned it into one of many unsolved missing persons cases stacked in district data repositories. Meanwhile, new incidents continued to occur in the area, including lost hikers, terrain accidents, and other emergencies, forcing authorities to focus on the present rather than cases already assessed as unlikely to benefit from further effective intervention. Within the local community, the names Daniel and Emily Harper appeared less and less in conversation, shifting from a frequently discussed case during the active search phase to a faint memory, occasionally referenced as yet another example of the Superstition Mountains dangers rather than a specific case requiring resolution. The combination of passing time, absence of new leads, gradual disintegration of the victim's family cohesion, and the case's removal from priority status created a prolonged state of stagnation in which the file existed more as an administrative entity than an ongoing investigation, reflecting the harsh reality of a system forced to balance the hope of resolving every case against resource limitations amid a constant stream of new emergencies requiring immediate response. Nearly 4 years after Daniel and Emily Harper's case file was classified as cold and had almost ceased to be mentioned in news reports or internal briefings, an unexpected event occurred one early morning on a federal highway running along the eastern edge of the Arizona desert, when a local resident called the police to report a woman appearing in an abnormal state by the roadside. The time of discovery was recorded before dawn, during a period of sparse traffic, when the woman was seen standing unsteadily near a drainage ditch a few meters from the roadway, barefoot, with clothing covered in dust and dirt, and showing clear signs of disorientation. The discovery location was a considerable distance from the Superstition Mountains, in an area with no dense residential population and not a place where pedestrians were commonly seen, making her appearance particularly noteworthy to the initial witness. When patrolling officers arrived at the scene, they noted that the woman could stand on her own, but moved slowly, reacting with unusual sensitivity to vehicle headlights and flashlights, frequently covering her face or turning her head to avoid direct light. Her initial physical condition showed evident severe emaciation, with a much thinner build than would be expected for her estimated age, pale and dry skin, cracked lips, and signs of prolonged dehydration. The clothing she wore was inappropriate for the current weather and surrounding environment, indicating it had been worn for an extended period without regular changes. Officers at the scene also observed numerous old and new scratches mixed across her body, with no signs of immediately life-threatening acute injuries, but sufficient to suggest she had endured a long period under harsh conditions. Behaviorally, the woman was either unable or unwilling to answer basic questions coherently, often stopping mid-sentence, displaying heightened wariness towards surrounding movements, and continuously scanning the area as if searching for or avoiding an invisible threat. She startled at sudden sounds and tended to retreat when someone approached too quickly. Nevertheless, when asked directly, she was able to provide her name as Emily Harper, a detail that immediately caught the officer's attention, as the name matched the file of a woman reported missing years earlier in the Superstition Mountains area. This information was preliminarily checked through the police communication system, and although no official confirmation existed at that moment, the possibility that the woman before them was linked to a serious cold case prompted a more cautious approach by law enforcement. Emily was taken into the patrol vehicle under protective conditions, neither handcuffed nor treated as a suspect, and was immediately transported to the nearest medical facility for initial health assessment, while ensuring she faced no immediate danger. Throughout the transport, officers noted that Emily rarely initiated communication, responding only briefly when questioned and often remaining silent for long periods. Yet she displayed clear signs of heightened tension whenever the vehicle slowed or stopped, as if fearing detection or being followed. Upon arrival at the hospital, medical staff admitted Emily under high-priority care, focusing first on physical stabilization before any in-depth evaluations, while police maintained a discreet presence to ensure her safety and avoid drawing unnecessary external attention. Information that a woman identifying herself as Emily Harper had been found alive after years missing was quickly relayed up the chain of command, but at that point it remained internal to avoid causing disruption or generating media pressure without official confirmation. The decision to protect Emily was made immediately, not only due to her vulnerable physical and psychological state, but also because of the possibility that she could be a witness or victim in a far more serious case than initially assumed years earlier. Officers assigned to directly oversee the case were instructed to limit unnecessary contact, meticulously document all of Emily's behaviors and statements in the initial phase, and closely coordinate with medical staff to ensure any information gathered did not negatively impact her condition. The sudden reappearance of Emily Harper, in the context of a case file cold for many years, immediately raised a series of serious questions about the accuracy of the original conclusions and about what had truly happened during her disappearance. But within this phase, all efforts by authorities focused on ensuring Emily's absolute safety, confirming basic information, and handling the situation as a particularly sensitive reappearance case before any further steps were considered. After Emily Harper was safely admitted to the medical facility and her initial physical condition stabilized to a permissible level, authorities proceeded with identity confirmation steps according to standard protocol for long-term missing persons reappearances, with the priority objective of independently and accurately determining whether the woman found was truly the Emily Harper who had gone missing nearly 4 years earlier. The first step in this process was fingerprint verification, conducted as soon as Emily was sufficiently alert to cooperate without causing additional psychological stress. Fingerprints were taken and compared against the national database storing biometric information from Emily's prior personal records, including data collected during administrative procedures related to her profession and identification documents. The fingerprint comparison resulted in a complete match with Emily Harper's record in the system, an important confirmation step but not yet deemed sufficient for a final conclusion in a case of such serious and complex nature. In parallel with fingerprinting, DNA testing was conducted to reinforce the identification, with biological samples collected under medical protocol and sent to a designated laboratory for comparison against reference DNA samples stored from Emily's family during the initial search years earlier. The DNA testing process occurred under strict chain of custody controls, ensuring no breaks in sample preservation and eliminating any possibility of mix-up, as the result would serve as a pivotal, indisputable confirmation of identity. When the analysis results were returned, the genetic data of the woman found showed near-perfect matching with Emily Harper's DNA sample, consistent with the familial relationships established in the records, thereby strongly reinforcing the assumption that this woman was indeed the missing Emily. In addition to biometric methods, medical record comparison was also performed to add an independent layer of verification, with doctors and investigators comparing Emily's pre-disappearance medical specifics against the current condition of the woman found. Details, such as medical history, old scars, dental structure, anatomical features, and other information recorded in prior medical files, were carefully cross-checked, and the results showed clear consistency across the data, including characteristics unlikely to be faked or coincidentally matched. Certain old medical markers previously provided by the family during the initial search, such as small scars from past surgeries or accidents, were also confirmed to be present on Emily's body, though their current state had naturally altered somewhat over time. All results from fingerprinting, DNA testing, and medical record comparison were compiled into an official identity confirmation report, signed and endorsed by the relevant agencies and entered into the case file, marking the first time since her disappearance that Emily Harper was legally and unequivocally confirmed to be alive and no longer presumed dead. The identity confirmation decision carried not only administrative significance, but also directly impacted case handling, as it required re-examination of the entire old file from a new perspective and changed Emily's status from presumed deceased to a living survivor requiring protection and support. However, at the time of confirmation, authorities maintained a high level of confidentiality over this information, strictly limiting external disclosure to avoid unnecessary pressure on Emily and to ensure any subsequent steps related to the case were conducted under tightly controlled conditions. The official confirmation of Emily Harper's identity closed the initial phase of her reappearance and established the legal and operational foundation for reassessing prior conclusions, but within the scope of this phase, the focus remained on completing the confirmation process fully, accurately, and without leaving any gaps that could later give rise to disputes. After Emily Harper's identity was officially confirmed, the focus shifted to a comprehensive medical evaluation phase to determine her current health status and clarify the physiological impacts that might reflect her living conditions throughout nearly 4 years of disappearance. This process was carried out by a multidisciplinary team of physicians, including internal medicine, nutrition, orthopedics, and forensic medicine, with a specific requirement to document in detail every diagnostically and legally significant abnormality. Initial general examination revealed Emily in a state of prolonged debilitation, with a body mass index significantly lower than her pre-disappearance medical data, slow heart rate, low blood pressure, and chronic fatigue presentation, inconsistent with someone who had merely undergone a short-term survival period in the wild, and instead suggestive of prolonged malnutrition and lack of medical care. Blood tests conducted immediately afterward showed Emily's vitamin D levels to be extremely low, far below the minimum threshold, a condition typically seen only in individuals who have spent extended periods without natural sunlight exposure. This finding was particularly notable because Emily's pre-disappearance medical records showed no issues related to vitamin D metabolism or absorption-impairing conditions. The severe vitamin D deficiency was assessed by doctors as highly unlikely if Emily had been living outdoors in a desert environment like the Superstition Mountains, where intense sunlight prevails year-round, thereby partially ruling out the hypothesis that she had been wandering or surviving freely in the wild for an extended time. In parallel with metabolic findings, musculoskeletal evaluation revealed pronounced muscle atrophy in Emily, particularly in major muscle groups such as thighs, calves, and shoulders, with uneven atrophy levels consistent with prolonged immobility or restricted movement in confined spaces. Doctors noted that Emily's bone density remained relatively stable while muscle mass had sharply declined, a pattern commonly seen in cases of confinement or prolonged bed rest, rather than continuous movement in a wild environment. Emily's mobility was also impaired, with limited joint range of motion, slowed reflexes, and pain during basic stretching movements, indicating her body had adapted to a controlled or severely restricted movement state over a long period. During detailed examination, doctors discovered faint, symmetrically distributed scars on Emily's wrists and ankles, with shapes consistent with marks caused by restraints, handcuffs, or fixation devices. These were not recent injuries, but long-healed with scar tissue development, indicating repeated pressure at the same locations over a significant period. Critically, these marks were incompatible with random injuries typical of outdoor accidents such as falls or impacts with rocks, which usually produce uneven, randomly distributed damage accompanied by broader abrasions. Additionally, the skin in these areas showed thickening and mild discoloration consistent with prolonged contact with rough or metallic materials, further supporting the assessment that Emily had been systematically, physically restrained. Forensic physicians also noted no evidence of congenital conditions or autoimmune disorders that could simultaneously explain the vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, and symmetrical marks on wrists and ankles, thereby ruling out natural medical causes and focusing on coerced environmental factors. When synthesizing all findings from general examination, biochemical testing, musculoskeletal assessment, and body mark analysis, the medical team reached a unified conclusion that Emily Harper's condition was inconsistent with any scenario of free survival in the wilderness, nor with voluntary reclusive living under normal conditions, but instead clearly reflected a prolonged period of confinement in an enclosed environment with limited light, restricted movement, and tightly controlled living conditions. This medical conclusion was documented in a detailed report emphasizing that the observed signs resulted from a process lasting many months or years, incapable of forming in a short time, and showed high consistency across multiple organ systems. The report also stated clearly that these findings held value not only for Emily's treatment and health recovery, but also carried significant implications for re-evaluating the nature of the original disappearance, as they directly contradicted the prior conclusion of presumed death due to exposure. However, within the scope of the medical evaluation phase, all assessments were limited to descriptive and expert conclusions without speculating on perpetrators or specific circumstances leading to this condition, but instead establishing a solid scientific basis. Emily Harper had survived for years under conditions of long-term confinement with clear physiological impacts that could not be explained by natural or random factors. Based on the completed medical and psychological evaluations, law enforcement authorities conducted a comprehensive review of the old case file regarding the disappearance of Daniel and Emily Harper. Previous conclusions were placed side by side with newly emerged evidence to assess their compatibility and identify irreconcilable contradictions that could not be overlooked. The initial conclusion of presumed death due to exposure was built on the assumption that the two victims had perished due to the harsh natural conditions of the Superstition Mountains, an assumption once considered reasonable in the absence of criminal evidence and with no bodies recovered. However, When cross-referenced with Emily's physical and psychological condition upon her reappearance, this assumption revealed irreconcilable inconsistencies. Investigators noted that medical signs, such as severe vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy from prolonged immobility, and symmetrical marks on the wrists and ankles, could not have occurred if Emily had been living outdoors or moving freely in a natural environment, and certainly could not coexist with the hypothesis of death by exposure. Furthermore, the psychological evaluation revealed conditioned fear responses, avoidance behaviors, and signs of prolonged trauma consistent with experiences of control and captivity rather than a survival accident. When these factors were juxtaposed with prior tracking results, particularly the abrupt termination of both victims' personal scent at an accessible point with no subsequent movement trails, the overall picture began to shift toward indicating human intervention. Investigators concluded that the new evidence not only invalidated the old conclusion, but also established a sufficient threshold of suspicion to consider the possibility that Daniel and Emily had become victims of an abduction, with removal from the Superstition Mountains area occurring within a short time after their disappearance. The simultaneous vanishing of both individuals, the lack of any continuing movement trail, and Emily's discovery years later at a location far from the mountain area further reinforced the hypothesis that at least one third party with the capability for control, transportation, and long-term confinement had been involved. On that basis, the case file was officially reclassified from a cold missing persons file, presumed to be an accident, to a full criminal investigation, with focus on offenses related to kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and prolonged violent acts. This decision triggered the reactivation of the entire investigative system, including reanalysis of old findings from a criminal perspective, recollection of family statements, review of initial search reports to identify details that may have been downplayed, and preservation of all evidence related to Emily's condition as potential exhibits. Given the seriousness of the case and its potential federal scope, particularly the possibility of victim transport across multiple jurisdictions and extended confinement, local investigators formally requested assistance from federal units, and the FBI was invited to join in a coordinating investigative role. The FBI's involvement brought specialized resources, including criminal behavioral analysis, federal tracing capabilities, and the ability to connect data across disparate regions in order to determine whether this case might be linked to similar files or individuals with prior histories of comparable offenses. Upon the FBI's entry, an interagency task force was immediately established, comprising representatives from county police, park rangers, forensic experts, psychologists, and federal agents, with the unified mission of reconstructing the entire sequence of events from the moment of disappearance to Emily's recovery. The initial coordination meetings focused on identifying outdated assumptions to be discarded, facts requiring re-verification, and new investigative priorities, with the abduction and long-term confinement hypothesis designated as the central axis of the renewed investigation. Reopening the case as a criminal matter also meant a fundamental shift in the approach to Emily, from a survivor requiring medical support to a key victim in a serious criminal case, with all necessary protective measures and legal support implemented to ensure her safety and ability to cooperate. At this stage, the focus of the authorities was not on identifying a specific perpetrator or filing charges, but on building a solid investigative foundation, critically re-examining old conclusions, properly weighing new evidence, and officially redefining the case as an intentional crime, ushering in an entirely different investigative phase from what had been believed for nearly 4 years prior. After the criminal investigation was formally reopened and the interagency task force established, one of the first priority tasks was to reconstruct the entire nearly 4-year period during which Daniel and Emily Harper were missing, not based on the prior accident assumption, but on the premise of abduction and prolonged captivity, with all old data re-examined from scratch. This process began with the recollection and reanalysis of security camera footage that had only been cursorily reviewed during the initial search phase, when no criminal indicators existed. Traffic cameras, gas station cameras, convenience store cameras, and service facility cameras within dozens of miles around the Superstition Mountains had their archived data pulled again, covering the time from when Daniel and Emily entered the mountain area through many days afterward. The focus was on identifying any vehicles or individuals appearing anomalously near trailheads during the relevant time frame. Although much data had been overwritten due to the long passage of time, some long-term archived footage still existed and was analyzed using advanced tools to detect recurring behavioral patterns, such as vehicles stopping illegally, making repeated U-turns, or appearing at locations inconsistent with normal traffic flow. Concurrently, investigators analyzed potential routes that could have been used to transport the victims out of the Superstition Mountains area based on the documented scent termination point from the initial search and the road network connecting the area to other remote parts of Arizona. These routes were evaluated against multiple criteria: degree of isolation, distance to populated areas, ability to avoid surveillance cameras, and access to potential long-term holding sites. The analysis revealed several corridors suitable for removing individuals from the mountain area without passing through heavily trafficked roads, particularly secondary routes leading to private land, abandoned mines, or rarely used structures. From this, investigators developed a set of plausible transportation scenarios, not to assert one specific route, but to delineate the geographic scope of locations where Daniel and Emily could have been taken in the early period after their disappearance. Another critical investigative track involved tracing food and fuel supply chains. This stemmed from medical conclusions that Emily had lived in conditions of severe natural light deprivation, restricted mobility, yet sustained life over a long period, requiring a stable supply of food, water, and energy. Investigators examined retail and wholesale transactions in the relevant area, focusing on anomalous purchasing patterns such as bulk buys of non-perishable food, fuel, propane tanks, or supplies suited to off-grid living. Data from small stores, remote gas stations, and local suppliers were re-reviewed by time period to detect stable recurring transactions over years that were not clearly tied to any identifiable household or business. At the same time, reports of fuel and supply deliveries to remote areas were cross-referenced with maps of plausible routes to determine whether a logistics chain consistent with long-term confinement existed. From these fragmented data points, the task force began constructing a model of prolonged captivity, assuming the victims were taken to a concealed location with minimal sunlight exposure, limited space for movement, and controlled by one or more individuals capable of maintaining minimal sustenance to keep the victims alive over an extended time. This model was not intended, at this stage, to pinpoint an exact location or perpetrator, but to test the feasibility of different hypotheses and rule out scenarios incompatible with the medical and behavioral evidence. Forensic and behavioral analysis experts contributed to this process, assessing whether the degree of control, consistency of living conditions, and duration of confinement aligned more with the behavior of a lone offender or required the involvement of multiple people or some form of support system. During the reconstruction, investigators also paid particular attention to the fact that Daniel did not reappear with Emily, raising questions about differing fates within the same confinement model, leading to adjustments that allowed for possible distinct phases or conditions across the 4 years of disappearance. The entire reconstruction was conducted as a reverse chronology investigative exercise, in which each new piece of data was examined, not only independently, but also for its consistency within the overall model. The outcome of this phase was not a complete answer, but a structured analytical framework that enabled the investigative team to move from general suspicion to identifying more specific investigative directions, supported by a logical foundation, showing that the disappearance of Daniel and Emily Harper was not a random sequence of events, but an organized, prolonged process requiring continuous control over nearly 4 years. From the 4-year missing persons reconstruction model that had been established, the Interagency Special Task Force began narrowing the geographic scope to identify suspected areas likely used for long-term confinement, Selection criteria included the degree of isolation, limited accessibility, the presence of pre-existing structures, and signs of prolonged human activity that did not attract attention from the surrounding community. Land maps, private property records, old mining data, and information on abandoned structures were layered with previously identified plausible transportation routes. This process highlighted several areas located off popular tourist paths, far from residential zones, but still reachable by road or secondary dirt tracks. Among these, one site that had seen small-scale mining activity decades earlier drew particular attention from investigators. The location featured abandoned mine shafts, several old cabins once used as temporary worker housing, and currently lacked regular management or monitoring. Access to the area was conducted discreetly, involving specialized units to ensure safety due to risks of tunnel collapse, toxic gases, and wildlife, while preserving all potential evidence. During the initial examination, investigators noted that one of the cabins showed signs of more recent use compared to surrounding structures, despite retaining an outwardly abandoned appearance with peeling paint and crudely covered windows. Inside the cabin, signs of long-term habitation gradually emerged as the forensic team conducted a detailed inspection. These included basic living items arranged in an orderly manner, repeated cooking marks in the same area, and utensils indicating sustained daily life rather than mere temporary shelter. The floor displayed concentrated wear patterns along fixed pathways. Walls showed grime buildup at heights consistent with regular human contact, and the interior layout appeared optimized to control light and visibility from outside. Expanding the examination scope, investigators discovered a discrete access path behind the cabin leading into an old mine shaft. This entrance had been temporarily reinforced with simple materials sufficient to obscure visibility and reduce incoming light. Entry into the mine was carried out cautiously with full protective gear. As they advanced deeper, signs of a distinct confinement area became increasingly clear. A small, isolated space separated from the main tunnel was found, with a structure indicating intentional modification, crude partitions, anchor points on walls and floor, and a basic but adequate artificial lighting system to sustain minimal living conditions without natural light. Biological traces, including hair and small skin fragments, were located in this area and carefully collected for analysis. Scratches and abrasion marks on stone and metal surfaces indicated prolonged human presence in the confined space. Investigators also identified signs of environmental control, such as materials used for insulation, sound dampening, and airflow restriction, suggesting deliberate efforts to maintain a discreet, hard-to-detect space from the outside. Comparing these traces with medical conclusions about Emily Harper's condition, particularly vitamin D deficiency and muscle atrophy from immobility, forensic experts determined that the conditions in the confinement area matched what had been documented on her body, strengthening the link between this site and her prolonged captivity. Furthermore, signs of long-term habitation were not limited to the separate confinement area, but extended to adjacent support spaces where traces of dry food storage, water, and fuel were found, indicating the site had been maintained as a self-contained living environment for an extended period without regular external contact. The discovery of this confinement site was not considered the final conclusion of the investigation, but it marked a significant turning point. For the first time, authorities had a specific location consistent with the established captivity model and potentially directly related to the disappearance of Daniel and Emily Harper. All activities at the scene were documented, sealed, and processed according to strict forensic protocols, with the goal of preserving every piece of evidence for subsequent investigative steps. This also opened a new phase in clarifying the site's role throughout the 4 years of disappearance, as well as the connection between the separate confinement space and the victim's fate. After the confinement site was identified and secured, forensic teams focused on determining Daniel Harper's fate through the search and analysis of related biological traces. His prolonged absence while Emily was found alive required establishing whether Daniel had escaped the confinement, died elsewhere, or perished during captivity. During the detailed examination of the mine area and surrounding support spaces, forensic experts discovered numerous scattered biological traces, including hair, soft tissue, and dried blood partially obscured by rock dust and thin sediment layers, indicating long-term presence. Samples were collected under strict chain-of-custody protocols and sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis to determine whether they belonged to Daniel Harper. Analysis results showed that several biological samples matched Daniel Harper's DNA profile, confirming his presence at the confinement site for a period of time after the disappearance. This ruled out the possibility that he had separated from Emily and left the area early on. Confirming Daniel's presence there also allowed investigators to focus on establishing a timeline of death, a complex task given the absence of an intact body and the harsh environment's potential to rapidly alter biological traces. Forensic experts employed multiple indirect methods to estimate time of death, including the degree of tissue decomposition, blood oxidation levels, surrounding sediment disturbance, and correlation between Daniel's biological traces and those identified as Emily's. The analysis revealed that Daniel's traces dated significantly earlier than those associated with the final phase of Emily's captivity, suggesting Daniel died before Emily was released or escaped the site. Combining this data with Emily's medical records, which showed no signs of recent close contact with Daniel for a long period before her discovery, investigators concluded that Daniel had died during the early or middle phase of the captivity period, not in the final months. Determination of cause of death was conducted through analysis of violence traces and environmental conditions at the confinement site. Although no intact body was found, indirect evidence could still reflect the circumstances leading to death. On several stone and metal surfaces in the separate confinement area, investigators found impact and scratch marks at heights corresponding to a human head and torso, along with bloodstains consistent with blunt trauma rather than sharp cuts. These signs, combined with the absence of evidence for random accidents such as tunnel collapse or free-fall injury, led to the hypothesis that Daniel may have died from violence or from prolonged harsh confinement conditions causing severe debilitation. Additionally, the lack of signs indicating that Daniel received medical care or recovery from injury was considered a key factor, as any serious untreated injury in a confined captivity environment could rapidly lead to death. Forensic experts also considered possibilities such as dehydration, malnutrition, or infection under confinement conditions, particularly if access to water and food was restricted or he was neglected during certain periods, and concluded that these scenarios aligned with the established captivity model. Synthesizing all biological evidence, temporal analysis, and scene traces, investigators officially concluded that Daniel Harper died during his confinement at this location, not due to a natural environmental accident as previously assumed, but due to factors directly related to the prolonged captivity process. This conclusion was documented in a detailed forensic report, stating that, although the precise final moments of Daniel could not be determined, the available evidence was strong enough to affirm that his death occurred within a context of control and deprivation of liberty, and therefore constituted a serious criminal act. Determining Daniel's fate not only resolved one of the case's largest questions, but also fundamentally changed the legal status of the file. From this point onward, the matter was no longer an unexplained disappearance or single-person captivity case, but a criminal investigation involving the death of a victim under unlawful confinement, laying the foundation for subsequent legal proceedings. After the conclusion regarding Daniel Harper's death in custody was established, the focus of the investigation shifted to identifying the perpetrator directly responsible for the kidnapping, unlawful detention, and resulting death of the victim, a process that required tightly linking physical evidence collected at the scene, reconstructed investigative data, and individuals who had potential access to and control over the detention site throughout the extended period. Investigators began by reviewing land ownership records, usage history, and transactions related to the mine area and the abandoned cabin, thereby identifying an individual who had legal access and regularly visited the location over many years, with economically unclear activities, but signs of maintaining continuous presence. Cross-referencing travel schedules, fuel and food purchase transactions with camera data and indirect witness statements showed that this individual was present in the area at the time Daniel and Emily disappeared, while continuing to appear regularly in the years that followed with behavior patterns consistent with maintaining a discrete residence. When biological evidence collected from the detention area underwent deeper analysis, forensic experts found matches between secondary DNA traces on fixed materials in the mine and the suspect's DNA sample, indicating this person's direct and repeated presence in the separate confinement space. Additionally, partial fingerprints collected from several metal objects and surfaces were identified as matching the suspect's biometric records, further strengthening the connection between this individual and the detention site. As the chain of physical evidence, logistical data, and behavioral analysis was synthesized, the task force determined that the evidentiary threshold was sufficient to proceed with an arrest, and an arrest operation was planned to ensure Emily Harper's safety as well as to prevent the suspect from destroying evidence or fleeing. The arrest was carried out at the suspect's current residence with no significant resistance, and additional items were seized during the search, including documents, equipment, and personal belongings that continued to provide indirect links to the detention site and the time frame of the crime. After the arrest, the suspect was transferred to federal authorities for processing under their jurisdiction, given the nature of the case involving kidnapping, interstate transportation of the victim, and prolonged detention, meeting the criteria for serious federal offenses. Federal prosecutors charged the suspect with a series of counts, including kidnapping, resulting in death, prolonged unlawful detention, violent acts causing death, and ancillary offenses related to concealing the crime, each carrying very severe penalties under federal law. During the pre-trial phase, the parties exchanged discovery, with the prosecution building its case on the consistency between physical evidence, forensic conclusions, and behavioral patterns, while the defense focused on challenging the chain of custody continuity and questioning the absence of Daniel Harper's intact body. However, the court's preliminary rulings determined that the indirect but systematic evidence, reinforced by scientific analysis, was sufficient to bring the case to trial before a jury. During the trial, prosecutors detailed the multi-year investigation process, from the initial disappearance, erroneous conclusions due to lack of evidence, to Emily's reappearance, and the medical and forensic findings that completely altered the case narrative. Forensic experts, medical professionals, and behavioral analysts were called to explain how biological traces, Emily's physical condition, and the structure of the confinement site interconnected into a logical chain, while investigators described the logistical tracing process and suspect identification. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt by emphasizing time gaps and the complexity of the terrain environment, but the presented testimony and evidence demonstrated a deliberate, prolonged, and highly controlled behavioral pattern that was difficult to explain by any random scenario. Throughout the trial, Emily Harper was not required to confront the defendant directly during the most sensitive phases in order to protect her psychological state, but her previously recorded medical reports and statements were admitted into evidence as important proof of the consequences of the detention. After several weeks of trial, the jury deliberated based on the totality of the evidence and arguments presented, with the central focus on determining whether the suspect bore criminal responsibility for the kidnapping and death of Daniel Harper. The final verdict was reached after the jury achieved unanimity, finding the defendant guilty on the key charges, thereby concluding the lengthy investigation and trial phase, while paving the way for sentencing under the strict federal sentencing guidelines for the established crimes. After an extended deliberation period, the federal jury returned to the courtroom and formally announced its verdict on the defendant, affirming guilt on all major charges related to the kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, and conduct resulting in Daniel Harper's death. A verdict based on consensus that the presented chain of physical, forensic, and behavioral evidence formed a consistent picture surpassing the reasonable doubt threshold under federal legal standards. Immediately following the jury's verdict, the trial proceeded to the sentencing phase, during which the prosecution emphasized the exceptionally grave nature of the case, not only the death of one victim, but also the prolonged detention period, the degree of control, and the dehumanization Emily Harper endured for nearly 4 years. The defense, despite attempting to present mitigating factors, could not deny the scale and consequences of the established conduct, and the federal court, after reviewing the entire record, arguments from both sides, and applicable law, imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, meaning the defendant would have no opportunity for release consideration for the remainder of his life. The sentence was pronounced in a heavy atmosphere, marking the legal conclusion of a case that had spanned many years and been misunderstood from the outset, while clearly establishing criminal responsibility for what happened to Daniel and Emily Harper. For the victims' families, the verdict and sentence brought a form of incomplete closure. While justice was served in the legal sense, the accumulated losses and trauma over many years cannot be erased. Daniel's family had to face the reality that he died in conditions of captivity, a painful truth, but at least clearly confirmed after years of living in limbo between hope and despair. Knowing Daniel's fate, however harsh, ended the prolonged ambiguity and allowed his family to begin the process of grieving and memorializing, rather than continuing to wait for non-existent answers. For Emily's family, the court's verdict officially confirmed that she was the victim of a serious crime, an outcome that carried significant meaning, not only legally, but also socially and psychologically, as it placed what she endured in its true context rather than the doubts or speculation that existed during the cold case phase. However, family reunification was not complete, as many relationships had been eroded or broken during the 4 years of her disappearance and the subsequent investigation years, leaving gaps that are difficult to fill. As for Emily Harper herself, after the trial concluded and related legal proceedings were completed, she continued under long-term medical and psychological care focused on physical recovery, treatment of malnutrition, and prolonged immobility consequences, as well as addressing complex psychological trauma arising from the detention period. Her current condition is assessed as stable but fragile, with gradually improving ability for independent functioning, though she still requires ongoing specialized support to readjust to life outside, a process experts say will take many years without a fixed timeline. Emily has not participated in public activities related to the case after sentencing, and authorities have respected her privacy by minimizing the release of personal information to avoid further harm. Administratively and legally, after the sentence took effect, and any potential appeals were resolved per regulations, the case file of Daniel and Emily Harper was officially closed, classified as a criminal matter fully resolved by federal court verdict. The archived file encompasses the entire process, from the initial missing persons report, search phases, erroneous conclusions due to lack of data, to the reopening of the investigation, identification of the detention site, clarification of the victim's fates, and prosecution of the perpetrator, becoming a complete record reflecting the full complexity and limitations of investigative work in wilderness environments and long-term cases. Closing the file holds not only procedural finality, but also marks the case's transformation from an unsolved question into a legal precedent, where initial errors and lessons learned are documented to improve future handling of missing persons cases. Although life without parole has been imposed and the perpetrator permanently removed from society, the case's consequences continue to persist in the lives of those involved, especially Emily Harper, who must rebuild her life from the fragments of 4 years of stolen freedom. For law enforcement agencies, the case closes as proof that a cold case can be completely overturned with new evidence, while underscoring the importance of retaining the ability to revisit old conclusions when seemingly fixed facts can change. For the victims' families, the court's final judgment places a period at the end of a long, painful journey in which justice was ultimately established. Though the price paid is something no compensation can restore, the story of Daniel and Emily Harper clearly reflects a reality in the United States today. Even a short trip can turn into a crisis if we underestimate risks and lack minimal layers of protection. The Superstition Mountains are dangerous not only because of the heat and terrain cut by canyons, but also because of the information void. When family receives no signal, assumptions easily slide toward they must have just lost service. The first lesson is to treat a communication plan like survival gear before leaving. Agree on check-in times, return points, and a what-if overdue plan. In the story, the family's early report to police helped activate SAR promptly. In real life, hesitation of even a few hours in the desert can cost lives. The second lesson is not to dismiss signs that don't look like getting lost. The K9 scent trail abruptly ending, an intact backpack, a neatly folded map. These are signals demanding a broader perspective, including possible human intervention. So when a loved one goes missing, provide investigators every smallest detail, and if there are unusual signs, persistently request the case be re-examined. The third lesson concerns community and systems. Emily was protected and identified through fingerprints, DNA, and medical records. That's why in the U.S., updating medical records, emergency contact information, and storing family DNA samples in missing persons cases is extremely important. Finally, the story reminds us that trauma does not end on the day of rescue. Vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, wrist, ankle marks, and PTSD require long-term recovery. Therefore, view survivors with respect, protect their privacy, and support their access to therapy. That is the truly complete justice in real life. If you're interested in complex missing persons cases like Daniel and Emily Harper, where even one small detail can completely change the conclusion, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next in-depth investigation stories. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video with another case where the truth only emerges when we dare to look back at what was once overlooked.